All right, everybody. Welcome back to the None of Our Businesses YouTube show and podcast. We've got kind of a special episode today. I'm going to be hosting in place of Ty, but as always, we're going to continue talking about business issues from the perspective of accountants. And actually, today we have three accountants. We have myself, we have Tammy Hess.
Hi, everyone.
And we have a new guest, Amanda Lilley.
Hi.
All right, thank you. So yeah, we wanted to do kind of a roundtable discussion on a couple of different topics. And so we're going to just kind of go through them one at a time. The first one that I thought would be good to kind of get everyone's opinion on and just kind of talk about the experiences that you've had in this arena would be attracting and retaining talent, because I know that for CPA firms and for all industries right now, that's a big challenge. And so I'd be curious to hear kind of, your perspective on that, Amanda.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. First off, great to be here, and thanks for having me on today. So part of a little bit of background on myself and kind of the perspective that I can bring to the table here. I am a CPA firm consultant, so I'm dealing with CPA firms all across North America on a daily basis with various different problems or issues that they're trying to tackle. So I think I have a lot of stories that I hear from clients, especially when it comes to the talent crisis that they're facing today, which seems to be a bigger issue than it ever has been in the past. Not just necessarily brought on by the pandemic, but it seems like just the general popularity of the accounting profession has been taking, I would say, a downturn as of more recently. And so I think, when I consult firms, I think a lot of the attention is on not only how do we get talent to us, but then how do we keep the talent, right? Since it's at such a scarcity. I think there's a lot of places you can go here. I think from an attracting standpoint, I think one of the biggest ones is making sure that you have your compensation strategy dialed in, right? If you're not keeping up with the market these days, you don't stand a chance with your competitors out there. And we're not only, when I say compensation, I don't necessarily just mean salary or bonus. I mean, what are the other benefits that you can offer to your firm, whether it be flexible work options, whether it can be, the little benefits here and there, offering meals to them, offering, health care, child care, things of that nature. I think these are becoming more and more important to not ignore, shall I say, as firms are just having trouble finding talent. I think the same things go for the retention play too, right? Making sure that your compensation is staying with the market or above, and making sure, I think typically, I have a little bit of background on the HR side of things too. And I think typically the strategy has always been to kind of assess compensation on a yearly basis. But I think with the inflation rates that we've been seeing, the last year, 2 years, I think firms are realizing that those analysis need to be done on a more regular basis, whether that be on a semi-annual basis, whether that be on a quarterly basis. I've had a lot of firms that I worked with that are doing one-time, spot bonuses just as a retention play to keep people with them. Sometimes with the stipulation of them staying with the firm at least 1 to 2 more years, otherwise having to repay that back. But I think that's just a big piece of why people are leaving for other opportunities. I think pay is a big one, as well as a couple of those other benefits that I mentioned earlier. I don't know if Charlie or Tammy, you have anything to add here too.
Yeah, I actually have a couple of questions because I was wondering if you can think of things that companies are doing or firms are doing that they think are, helping retain or attract folks, but are actually doing the opposite or maybe not working as intended.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think what these younger generations of talent that are coming into firms are wanting are a lot different than maybe what the older generations wanted at the CPA firm, right? I think one of those big ones is being, traditionally, I think when you got into public accounting, there was this end goal of, I'm going to get into public accounting and I'm going to make partner one day. And that's what everybody wants, right? That's everybody's goal. And I think there's been a transition and not so many people are wanting that anymore. And so I think, when firms are saying, we have like opportunities here to make partner. Well, it's like, but is that really what these younger generations are looking for? And I would say a lot of times the answer is no.
Mhm.
And I think what more talent is looking for is just flexibility, right? Not necessarily just when you work, but also where you work. I think those are two important things that a lot of times people just don't, firm leaders don't, think about or understand. I would say those are a couple of things.
Absolutely. No, I agree. There's another thing I think you said that I want to kind of touch on, and that's the point of kind of the cadence of when a company might do a sort of salary review and whatnot. And I think there's kind of a lot of debate on that topic about what's the best way to think about that. But from my perspective, it's always just been that whatever time frame you think that your employee would then go looking for a job under. If they go looking every month, then you need to be thinking about it in some way every month. Now, maybe you don't make a change or do a review or whatnot every time, but really, when you do that, what you're trying to do is be competitive against those that he might or she might look for. And so, yeah, I just thought that was kind of a interesting thing that a lot of people might not have visibility into how often their employees are out there searching the field or things like that.
Absolutely. And I think it's probably no surprise to people in the accounting industry, especially those with a background or at least knowledge of the public accounting landscape, is that oftentimes people are jumping ship after a busy season, right? Because that's when they've worked the most amount of hours. That's when they're the most burnt out. That's when they're the most disgruntled about whatever's going on. And so I think being extra cognizant of that, especially, I advise my clients, maybe it's not paying a bonus at December 31st. Maybe you need to start thinking about paying bonuses, April 16th or October 16th as a token of appreciation in the more immediate term than waiting until the end of a calendar year to do so when maybe work isn't as busy or people, aren't coming off those really steep times of having increased hours.
Well, and I like that idea because it puts it in the time frame where the work is being performed and it's going to be the most motivational. I guess it kind of depends on how you look at a bonus, right? Is it to incentivize future work or is it to reward prior work or some mix of both? For me, it seems like the most obvious use of it is to incentivize the current work being done because that's when you're making the acute choice to give out a bonus,
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that's interesting.
Yeah. I definitely think it depends too, because I would say what I would encourage, any employer really, especially, obviously in the CPA traditional firm, but is to be more on the proactive side of really reviewing the compensation package and what the market is, because I think that is kind of the it's been years since I've been in a traditional CPA firm, but I know it was very rigid in terms of every year, and I can't remember what even month it was, but you do your performance evaluation, you have your compensation. If you got promoted, it was all done in that, that certain month of the year. But I think that if you wait too long, to your point, Amanda, you may be too late, especially if they're already looking. If an employee, and I would say most employees are at least keeping track of what the market is out, what's out there, what other people in their talent pool are getting paid, that employers should do the same thing. And if you see it, a strike or an increase in compensation, that you take that time to do it then, in terms of, not waiting for a particular period of time or analyzing it too much, right? Because I think that that's the other risk that I'm sure we've all fallen into, where you kind of wait to see what the numbers look like, you kind of analyze it, you make the equation a lot more complicated than needed. And then all of a sudden you're 3 months out and you haven't adjusted your compensation and you're not competitive to market.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, now more than ever in any industry, really, not just accounting, but, transparency is just with the internet and social media and everything, people know and can find compensation, salary data within seconds, right? And so I think, to think that things won't be made public or people won't find out what other people are making, I think is just, I think you're living with tunnel vision, right? Because I just don't think that's the reality. And I think too, one thing I encourage a lot of my clients with as well is to just have, again, those open lines of communication within your firm and within your company. And I think if, encouraging people that if they feel that they're underpaid based on what they're doing or, other comparable positions in their field, to bring that to their attention, right? I don't think it necessarily needs to be a contentious conversation. I think it's more just, hey, like, this is what I'm seeing. I'm just wondering, like, is there any way that I can get there? We can get there, meet in the middle somehow. I think it's just beneficial not only for the employee, but also the employer. So they have additional kind of data to go off of in the future.
No,
I love that. I think that I've always encouraged, and when I've worked with teams or supervised teams, I've always said, hey, like, if before you're actually thinking about leaving or for whatever reason, please come talk to me. In the sense of like, if there's something that I could do to help or to fix, and whether it be compensation, whether it be just the overall job engagement or, enjoyment of the current role. And I remember when I would say that, people were like, should I tell you that I'm leaving? Like, is that going to change your perspective of my position or my tenure here? And then would you be trying to, exit me out? And it's like, I love that idea where that's not what it is. It's a conversation because, at the end of the day, I think, you want your employees to be successful and you want the company to be successful. And so a lot of that is communication and conversation. And that, I love that. It doesn't have to be contentious, to your point. That's a great thing. Do you feel like most people are, because I remember when I would share that, I would get a lot of kind of hesitation or like, I'm not sure if I should do that. Do you still think that that's a case where, folks are still a little bit hesitant to have that open dialogue?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is something that it's going to take time for employees to become more comfortable with this. I do think, though, what we've seen the last few years, especially, is, I don't want to say necessarily control, because I think that's a strong word, but I will say there's been kind of a shift in who really has like the power at the end of the day. And I think traditionally it's always been the employer, right? The employer says, this is what you're going to do, this is what you're going to make, take it or leave it. And I think what we're realizing is that because there's such a scarcity for talent and a demand for it, with supply being so low, really that power has shifted over to the employee now, right? And so the employee gets to dictate a lot of, what is job crafting, right? What is their job going to look like and what are they going to get paid? In large part driven by the market. But I think that there's been a shift that's pretty undeniable, right? I think employees and prospective employees are becoming a lot less hesitant to have these conversations or to even counter, prior to accepting a job. I think we're seeing a lot of that where, they get a job offer for 60,000 and they say, how about 70, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's becoming more and more common to have those conversations. I won't say that I still don't think that the majority feel comfortable having those conversations, but I do think we're seeing an increase for sure.
I've always thought it's kind of an interesting thing because it's like, if you don't want people to know how much other people make, it always makes me wonder, does that mean that part of your kind of business strategy is deception or right, secretive things that really don't help anyone overall? But the other thing I'm thinking about is I think a lot of people respond to goals and benchmarks. And so if you have an open discussion with your employee, you say, I can't give you a raise because we as a firm are not making enough. And these are the 5 things that I think are leading to us not making enough. How can you help change those things? And then that person goes out and does something about it. Well, suddenly you two are aligned on that goal, agree on what the issue is. And now, all incentive or all motivation is pointing in the right direction. Right. And so I think sometimes that discussion just doesn't happen. Some firm might not do well. Nobody's talking about why or having constructive conversations about why, and just kind of goes through the motions, And so I think that's a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I work with a lot of firms on designing specifically their partner compensation systems. And one of the big things that I'm an advocate for is tying that compensation to goals, not only individual goals, but the strategic goals of the firm. And if those two aren't aligned, then, how are you going to be profitable and around in the future, right? And I think it goes for, while I work a lot with partners, I think it goes for the rest of employees as well. I think, every employee should have goals. I know my company is a big proponent for the entrepreneurial operating system. And part of that system is setting quarterly goals for all of the employees. So I have quarterly goals that I have to meet, that I am part of, creating and advocating for too. Not only do they benefit me professionally, but they benefit the firm. And so, yeah, I really like that point, Charlie, because I think goals are very important, both from an individual and a firm perspective.
Well, and I think that leads us into the next topic really well, which is mentorship and kind of talking about how, because, one goal of a lot of people is to kind of find their way up to a higher position in the firm or whatnot. And so I know there's a lot of strategy and thought leadership that kind of goes into how to really do that best, how to mentor somebody well. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that topic.
Yeah. Mentorship is a tricky one, right? Because I don't think everybody necessarily can be a good mentor, right? I think that's a special skill set that some people they have it, some people they don't. And I think forcing people to be a mentor isn't always a good, idea either, right? I will say, I think every CPA firm that I work with, if there's one thing that I always tell them if they don't already have one is to get a mentor program. I think this is especially important for newer employees, right? They're entering a world that they've most likely never been in, especially if they're entry level coming right out of school. I remember starting my first job in public accounting and just feeling so lost. Like, what am I doing? I don't know what I'm doing. Like, what am I supposed to be doing? If I have questions that I don't necessarily want to go to my manager for, is there another person that I could feel more comfortable going to that would help me, that I know is, kind of looking out for me and on my side? I worked one of the best firms that I feel like have demonstrated a good mentor program, is for all of their managers, they're mentored by a partner or somebody on the executive committee there. And I think, I think they've seen a lot of traction with that, with implementing that mentorship program of not only getting, people to develop, faster, but I think having them stick around longer, like knowing that the firm is out there caring for them, that somebody's going to be actively caring about their professional development on a regular basis, I think is huge. Like, we're all human at the end of the day, right? And I think knowing that somebody's out there kind of looking over us and making sure that we're succeeding is a good feeling, right? And so I think it's critically important. I would say not just for one level, I think it's important for all levels of employees at your firm. So yeah, that's where I would go with this one.
No, I agree completely. I mean, for me personally, it's one of the big things that has kind of attracted me to this firm that I'm working at now, is really that I feel that the people I work with take my professional development seriously. And that's not something that is always the case, right? I've worked many jobs in the past where you have a role, you have a job, but it is exactly that and will never be more than that. And that's just kind of the way it is. And so I think that feeling of feeling like you can, somebody's on your team striving to make you do better, is a really strong feeling and really helpful.
I also liked what you said, Amanda, about how not everyone should be a mentor. And I think that I have definitely seen in my past where, in order for you to be a manager or going to partner, you had to have X amount of people that you provided mentorship for. And if that's not in your wheelhouse, it's really unfortunate for the person that you're mentoring, right? And so I think that is a key thing where not to force that onto somebody, because it's going to be actually more detrimental to the person receiving that mentorship than anything else. And the other thing I kind of wanted to discuss too is the idea of tailoring the mentorship program, or tailoring the type or the way that you mentor someone based on the person themselves, right? Because I think there's been a lot of times where there could be kind of a rigid plan of like, here's the checklist, or here's the topic points, or here's the goals for that particular person, and they're different, and they could be different from somebody else. And so I wonder if you have any kind of tips or suggestions for folks who are mentoring, large groups of people.
Yeah, I think, like you said, everybody's different. I think, it's not a one size fits all situation for sure. I encourage firms, a lot of times they're like, how do we structure this? How do we match mentees with mentors? And I think there's definitely kind of a knowledge period that needs to happen of mentees almost interviewing mentors or potential mentors, right? Because you don't, again, want to get into a situation where it's just an assignment, right? Like, this mentor is going to be with this mentee and that's how it's going to be, because I just don't think that that's setting anybody up for success. And so I think a lot of it comes down to personality fit. I think that plays a big role in the relationship. I think also oftentimes what I find is that people on similar, at least what they, for instance, I'll say career paths here is if you have an entry level staff coming in and they know, hey, I just want to make it to manager and then kind of that's where I want to cap my career. Not necessarily saying I'm going to leave, but I don't want to go any further than that, right? Matching them with maybe a manager that kind of has the similar mentality or trajectory in their career may make the most sense, right? Because they're going to be able to provide input and guidance on what do I need to do to get there? What are things I need to think about? And so I think those are some big things that I would say as far as going about that. I do also want to mention too that oftentimes when it comes to things like this within a firm, I would say mentoring falls under this bucket as well as other maybe informal training or formal training and development. Is what I hear from a lot of firm leaders and management is, well, we just don't have time, right? There's so many other billable projects that I could be working on. Why would I then devote more of my time to mentoring or training and development when it just seems like that's not bringing in the money, right? And I think leaders are doing themselves a huge disservice when they have that mentality, because these are the staff. This is your succession plan, right? Like if you don't develop and mentor these people now, you're not going to have anybody to buy you out when you're ready to retire, right? You're just going to have to lock the door and leave the keys under the mat because nobody's going to be there. And so I just encourage firms to take these things seriously and carve out an appropriate amount of time for your professionals to be able to do these types of things and encourage it along the way. Because I think it's important. And I think it oftentimes gets overlooked, especially when you're comparing it to billable work.
No, I agree with that completely, because I think a lot of times what happens is when you don't successfully have a mentor-mentee relationship, a discussion that may have saved you money or time in the long run doesn't happen. And so even though you feel like, oh, I saved money by not having anybody devote their time to being a mentor, what's really kind of insidious about it is that you actually pay for it behind the scenes by virtue of something that should have been done quick, taking a lot longer because two people who could have talked through it and learned and whatever, that just didn't happen. And so I think that's one of the things that is a little bit more invisible to the business operator, because they don't see that part of it. They just see what they build, and so they learn to think only in terms of revenue and billings and that sort of a thing. But like you said, it's a much more complicated relationship than that.
One thing I was going to ask, Amanda, is do you think that firms are more open to hearing kind of what people's plans are, or where they want to cap at or cap out at? Because I know that, again, it has been a long time since I've been in there, but I remember it was kind of taboo to say, like, I'm going to be here for 2 years and out, or, to get my license, or I only want to be a manager. I never want to be a partner, or I want to, work all the way up to maybe a senior manager and then kind of exit out or something. And so usually it was like, we were kind of told when I was a new hire a long time ago, was like, you need to say you're wanting to be partner. Like that's going to be the goal, because you want to make sure that you set up for success, because the way that they may deploy you on certain engagements or give you the opportunities may be different if they don't think that you're a long-term or consider you a long-term employee. And so I was wondering if that has kind of shifted as well in the last, I won't say how many years, but in the years of where we are today.
Yeah. I will say this. I would say that I think we've seen a shift in at least the firms that I've been talking to. I think firms are genuinely interested in knowing kind of where people want to land ultimately. Granted, that's going to change. Like, I think that from day one to 5 years in, that can look very different. But I think firms are appreciating the transparency from their employees. Now, I'm not sure that they appreciate hearing in 2 years I'm going to be out, especially from an entry-level employee. But I think having the more general conversations of like, hey, I'm just starting at this firm. Realistically, right now, I see myself making manager and then kind of not wanting to progress any further. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to be leaving. It just means that from a responsibility standpoint, I'm not sure I would want to take on any more than that. And I think that's really helpful, because I think from a firm standpoint, they can obviously plan accordingly on their end. But I think from an employee standpoint, like, you're putting that out there. and I think hopefully your firm is responding well and being like, hey, we still have a place for you, regardless of whether you want to stay at manager, whether you want to go to partner, whatever it may be. I don't think they're going to be like, sorry, we don't want any more managers, you're going to have to leave. And if that's the case, there's certainly plenty of other firms that would take them. But so yeah, I would say those general types of conversations, I'm not necessarily sure they're going to lead to like exit conversations, but I think transparency is just good all around.
Yeah. And I agree. And I think that it's also hard too, like as a first year, you probably aren't sure, right? Like, I think for the most part, you don't know. There's a whole new world, right? Where I definitely do think that, as you progress in your career, especially, as a senior or manager, you're kind of like, you will know a little bit more for certain if this is for you or if it changes, right? Like, I think that to your point, you think that in your first couple of years, you're like, oh, this is never going to work out, or I just want to be a manager because that's the best role for me. But then realize, actually, no, I kind of do want to go to the partner group, and having those transparent conversations it's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where mentoring comes into play. I think that's huge as far as the education piece goes. Because yeah, like you said, I think a lot of people enter public accounting, I think dreaming of what it might be to be a partner, but then, getting through the front door and going for that first busy season and thinking, gosh, like all partners do is just work all the time. And then that perspective kind of changes. But then I think also as you go along, I think there's more education and mentoring that can happen of like, hey, it's not always what it looks like, from the outside of what's going on the inside. And so I think it can go both ways as far as change goes. I think, thinking you're going to make partner and then backtracking, or thinking you want to stop at manager and then getting the manager and realizing like, hey, maybe it's not so bad to be a partner in a CPA firm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think just talking about the point of like a person who might say, I'm going to leave in 2 years, and wouldn't want to share that with their manager because they don't want to kind of be put in a bad light or whatnot. But I think even that's an interesting one, because it's like, well, if that manager is going to find out in 2 years that you're leaving either way, it may be hard to hear at the beginning of it, but they would like to know so that they can at least plan for that, put you on engagements that are going to make sense for that time horizon and that kind of a thing. And so I think even sometimes the hard conversations that don't feel good on the first day are actually still needed and necessary and helpful to all involved, if everybody's willing to have them.
Well, and I think Charlie, sorry. But yeah, so I think Charlie, to that point though, it could also be, if you're thinking that, hey, I don't want to necessarily be here, it could also be a great mentor that says, what are those reasons why? And maybe your career path could be different, because maybe what you're seeing, for example, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this in terms of the pathway to partnership, but there's different paths, I believe, that you could take, right? And if you're modeling after someone maybe who's doing it all by hours or something and just having a lot of hours, and you're like, there's no way I'm going to ever want that. It's a great conversation to pause and say, well, what does it look like for you? Like, what kind of engagements do you want to be on that would encourage you to want to stay, or encourage you to want to change your career path? Or what industry do you want to be a part of? Maybe that's what the switch could be. Like, it could be either or, like to your point, Charlie, either design it to be on engagements that make sense for a period of time and kind of, developing a good exit strategy, or developing a kind of portfolio that will encourage you to want to stay long-term and build your tenure.
No, absolutely. I think these are all really good points, and it kind of leads us well into the next topic, which is that I know for a lot of the people listening to this podcast, I mean, if you're listening to an accounting podcast, you're probably in the accounting world in some way. And so I know that in a lot of people's eyes, becoming a partner is really the ultimate goal for them. And so I think that there are a lot of things that apply specific to mentorship and whatnot, but perhaps there are things that are particular to the accounting industry, or particular to those who want to become partners, that might be relevant to kind of talk about. And so I want to get your ideas on just the topic of path to partner in a CPA firm.
Yeah, sure. Like I mentioned earlier, I think we've seen a shift in probably the past, I would say 5 to 10 years of, sadly, the accounting profession is not as desirable to a lot of younger generations as it once was. I think traditionally it's been seen as a very stable career path where, you're always going to have work, you're going to get paid a decent amount. Sure, you're going to work some long hours during some months of the year, but is still very attractive from the outside. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of younger generations, just their idea of how they want to live their life and the lifestyle that they want to live doesn't necessarily align with the traditional CPA firm work model, right? I think we're very much used to the 9 to 5, you're going to be in the office, you're going to be, working 12, 14, 16-hour days during busy seasons, you're going to come in on Saturdays, you're just going to be dedicated to the firm, when times are busy. And so I think a lot of these entry-level staff, senior, even managers are looking kind of up at the partners who all they see is them working all the time. They're never taking vacation. They're the first ones to get into the office. They're the last ones to leave, type of thing. And I think they're getting a little bit of a bitter taste in their mouth about what does partnership mean? Are there really any benefits, or is it all just, suck, basically? And I think a lot of what I help firms do is realize, I think there's just, the reality is, I think a lot of people have misconceptions about what it actually means and what are the benefits and what are they getting from it. And I think one of the big ones is staff perceive that partners work a lot more than they actually do. And I think when you actually look at the numbers and the hours, it's a lot less than what people think, right? And I also think a lot of times we'll go into firms and I'll ask their staff and senior groups, what do you think an average partner in your firm makes? And what I end up finding is that it's considerably less than what partners actually bring in. And so I think there's a big piece of just miseducation of, what does it mean? What are you going to be responsible to do? What are going to be the upsides, but what are also the potential downsides, right? You're going into an ownership position, meaning it's not all reward, but it's also not all risk. And so I think there's just a lot of, again, misconception, lack of education around partnership, from my point of view, at least.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Is there anything that you think that people who are interested in kind of in becoming, because we talked a little bit about what a firm can do to help mentor a person onto this path to partner. Are there things that people who are listening to this who want to become partners, that things that they can do to kind of be better prepared for that or to have that discussion more easily?
Yeah, I think I encourage, those go-getter employees to definitely start having the conversations early. Ask your managers or ask your partners to sit in on things like sales calls or go to lunch with clients with them just to see how this all works, right? And the managers and the partners need to be open to this and be thinking about this too. If you can identify those superstar employees, you need to be doing everything you possibly can to keep and retain them, right? And so I would just encourage those employees to ask questions when they have them along the way, to not be afraid. But I also encourage partners especially to be transparent and open and not wait for the questions to come. I think educating your staff on this as soon as you can, even in the recruiting process, I think is important. I think, sure, some people may not know that they want to make partner or may think that it's not in their wheelhouse to ever be there. But I think with a little bit of education and encouragement and goal setting and mentorship, oftentimes they can get there and want to get there, right?
And I think a lot of times people think they can't because they don't realize what stands in the way. And when they have those open discussions about here's the things that need to happen for that to happen, then suddenly that person has a goal they can work on, and it becomes aligned incentives and that kind of a thing. And so yeah, I think those are all really good topics on it. What do you think, Tammy?
Yeah, I do. Amanda, do you think that there's an average timeline that people can expect? Because I think that's the other question I have. Do people have realistic expectations in terms of, if I'm a brand new first year, when can I expect to become partner? When should I expect to become partner? Because I think that there may be some times where it's I could do that in, 5 years. And there's some people who maybe don't even know what to expect. And then they're sitting there for 20 years. And so kind of being am I going to be a partner yet? So I didn't know if there's an average or what the expectations are.
Yeah, I would say on average, what I'm seeing is anywhere from 10 to 15 years. Is pretty typical. I would say 10 is on the more accelerated track, 15 maybe being on not necessarily the slower, but the more normal track, will you say. I think anything longer than that and I would start to question whether the firm is just dragging their feet or that person's just not a good fit. And, there hasn't been a conversation of like, hey, this probably isn't going to work out type of thing. But I would say 10 to 15 years is pretty normal.
Yeah, so definitely not 5.
I've never heard of 5. That's not to say it would never happen, but I personally have never seen 5.
And in that thought process, then too, like if you are, a person who's considering to be a partner and you're kind of in, 5, 10 years or in any time in there, when do you start having those conversations? I think those are great when you're talking about like joining into those client meetings or asking those partners kind of like, what's the pathway for me to get there? When is a good time to start having those conversations with the partner group?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm not necessarily sure there's too soon of a time, right? I would say, if you're an entry level person and you're just a go-getter, right? And you're like, past a partner it is, I'm going to make equity partner. That's what I want. I mean, I don't think you should shy away from making that known, because I think then they can start kind of crafting and paying more attention to getting you involved in different things and opening up opportunities for you based on that information. I think the conversation changes, right? I don't think that you necessarily have the same conversations with staff about partnership that you do with senior managers, right? I think once you start getting up into those higher levels, that's where we typically see firms sharing more finite details of like what partnership means, right? What is the buy-in going to look like? What is a partner retirement buyout looking like? What are clauses in the partner agreement that you're going to have to adhere to? What are expectations of partners at our firm? Things of that nature that you probably wouldn't necessarily share with, a brand new staff, but become more relevant and important to share with people that are closer to partnership than others.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's good, good food for thought for people who are looking to kind of go down that path. Because I think a lot of those people are listening to this podcast, hopefully. Yeah, so I think these are all really good topics for discussion on sort of how to attract talent, how to retain talent, how to mentor that talent, and really ultimately how to cultivate them into the path of growing to a partner in a CPA firm. And I think a lot of things we talked about today can be applied to any industry. So if you listen to this and you're not in the accounting world, most of these things we're talking about, all businesses or many businesses have partners, many businesses need mentors, many businesses need to attract and retain talent. So I urge you to kind of think about how these things might apply to you and your business, or really other businesses that you might be looking to get into, because this whole discussion applies to the person looking to move up as well. And so, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us here on this podcast and for sharing your experience and these topics for discussion. And it's been really great talking to you.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, I think that brings us to a close for today. So thank you all for joining us for another episode of None of Our Business, where we discuss news in business, accounting, and taxes from an accountant's perspective. And this time was a little bit different, where we had a roundtable. So please hit the like and subscribe buttons if you're watching this on YouTube, or rate us on your podcast app. We'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.